Imagine silence. Not the kind of silence you find in the fields before dawn, not the silence of a sleeping house, but an absolute dead silence. The kind that only comes after you've been deafened by an unimaginable roar. It is a silence in which you can hear dust settling on the scorched earth. A silence where you can feel the blood run cold in your veins. August 6th, 1945. Approximately 9 in the morning. Lieutenant Akira Sato is on his knees in the middle of what, an hour ago, was the runway of a military airfield east of Hiroshima. His uniform, so recently a source of pride, is now a collection of charred rags stuck to his skin. He doesn't feel the pain from the burns. He feels nothing at all except for this all-consuming ringing void in his ears. He looks at his hands. Strong, calloused pilot's hands that were meant to be gripping the controls of a Zero fighter as it dove toward an enemy aircraft carrier. But now, those hands tremble, coated in gray ash, and he cannot force them into a fist. His eyes, young, 19-year-old eyes that only yesterday burned with the fanatical fire of faith in a divine emperor and a sacred mission, are now empty. They stare west, toward where the city should be. The city where his mother waited for him in a small house with paper walls. The city he was supposed to protect with his life. But the city is gone. In its place, stretching to the horizon, is a scorched, smoldering plain, over which a monstrous, unearthly flower of fire and smoke slowly blooms in an unnaturally blue sky. A mushroom. He had never seen anything like it. No one had. It was something beyond war, beyond human comprehension. It was like the wrath of an ancient god descended upon the earth to punish mankind for its hubris. Akira was a kamikaze, a divine wind. His body was a honed weapon, his soul a sacrifice laid upon the altar of victory. An hour ago he was ready to die. He craved that death. He saw it as the highest honor, the apotheosis of his service. But his death was stolen from him. First, by the stubborn coughing engine of his plane, which refused to start at the critical moment. And then, by this second sun that had risen over Hiroshima. And now he, Akira Sato, a pilot of the Special Attack Unit, was alive. Alone. In a world where everything he believed in, everything he was ready to die for, had been turned into radioactive ash. He was a soldier without an order, a warrior without a war, a living dead man in a dead world. And in that deafening silence broken only by the distant crackle of burning structures, he asked himself the one question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Why me? Why had he survived when everyone else was dead? That question was heavier than any shame, more terrifying than any wound. It was a question with no answer. But to understand how a young pilot, filled with fanatical faith, turned into this broken man kneeling in the ashes of civilization, we must go back just a few hours to the last morning of the old world, when there was still only one sun, and death still seems simple and clear. A few hours before the end of the world, the morning of August 6th, 1945, was filled with a quiet, almost meditative solemnity. The air over the small field airstrip was thick and humid with summer heat, smelling of grass, hot metal, and the faint scent of hydrangeas blooming somewhere in the distance. For Lieutenant Akira Sato, this was not just another day. It was his day. The day he had been moving toward his entire short but meaningful 19-year-old life. Today, he was to become part of something great, to dissolve into eternity, to become the divine wind that would sweep the enemy from the face of the sacred Japanese land. He sat in the Caesar position on the crudely built veranda of a barracks, looking at his aircraft, a light Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, parked a few dozen meters away. It had already been prepared. A single 250-kilogram, about 550 pounds bomb was slung beneath the fuselage, and the tanks were only fueled for a one-way trip. There was no return ticket. His fingers slowly and methodically tied a snow-white hachimaki headband with the image of the rising sun onto his forehead. The silk was cool and smooth, a pleasant chill against his sweat-soaked skin. Characters were painted on the band, 7 lives for the Emperor. He repeated them to himself like a mantra, pouring all his faith, all his resolve into those words. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about honor. For him, raised in the strict traditions of the Code of Bushido, death in battle was not an end, but a culmination, the highest point of service. He was taught that a personal life was nothing compared to the life of the nation, embodied in the figure of the divine emperor. And he believed this as sacredly as he believed the sun would rise in the morning. He remembered his mother's face. He had last seen her a week ago. She didn't cry when he said goodbye. In her eyes, there was only an endless, quiet sorrow and pride. She handed him a small amulet from the temple, wrapped in silk, and her hands, dry and warm, squeezed his for a moment. "Go with honor, my son," she whispered. And that was all. No tears, no pleas. She was a samurai's daughter, and she understood duty. He touched the amulet, now hanging from his neck beneath his flight suit. It was his only connection to the past, to the world he was voluntarily leaving behind. Beside him sat 3 other pilots from his squadron. They were also scheduled to fly out today. They silently drank sake from small ceramic cups. It was a ritual. The last cup on this earth. Their faces were calm, almost serene. They spoke of trivial things. Yesterday's dinner, a mechanic's clumsy joke, how beautifully the sakura blossoms in spring. They avoided looking each other in the eye, not because they were afraid of seeing fear there. No, there was no fear. There was something else. A piercing, almost painful awareness of the value of every moment, every breath. They were no longer quite alive, but not yet dead. They were suspended in a timeless space, just a few steps from eternity. The squadron commander, an old captain with a face creased with wrinkles like an old map, walked among them, pouring the final cup. He gave no grand speeches. He just looked at each of them with a long, heavy gaze that mixed fatherly pride with unbearable bitterness. When he reached Akira, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not dishonor the name of your ancestors, Sato," he said quietly. "Yes, sir, Captain," Akira replied, his voice steady. He stood up. The time had come. He bowed to his comrades, to the barracks, to the sky. He walked toward his plane, and each step echoed in his soul. He felt the eyes of everyone at the airfield on him. Mechanics, armorers, other pilots. In their eyes, he saw admiration, envy, and something else. Something akin to compassion. They were sending him off as one sends a god to the heavens. He climbed into the cramped cockpit, which smelled of gasoline and hot oil. Everything was familiar, everything in its place. He placed his hands on the controls, and the plane felt like an extension of his body. He was ready. He was calm. He was happy. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing his target, a massive American aircraft carrier, a steel monster spewing death. He saw his Zero becoming a fiery arrow, piercing the enemy ship's deck, saw everything exploding in a blinding flash. It would be beautiful. It would be right. It would be his final and greatest work of art. He began the startup procedure. The instruments came to life. The needles flickered. He pulled the starter handle. Once. Twice. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. In the ensuing silence, he could hear his own heart pounding furiously. The silence, broken only by the strained, sick cough of the engine, pressed on his eardrums with unbearable force. Akira yanked the starter lever again and again, his movements growing sharper, more desperate. Cold sweat ran down his temples, mixing with the dust that had settled in the cockpit. The Nakajima Sakai engine, the heart of his faithful Zero, which had never failed him, had today become a stubborn, capricious beast. It would let out a few convulsive gasps, shroud the plane in a cloud of bluish smoke, and fall silent again, as if mocking him. Mechanics were already swarming around it. Their grease-smeared faces expressed extreme concentration and anxiety. They worked their magic over the open cowling, their hands a blur among the tangle of wires and tubes, but the motor remained dead. In the distance, Akira heard the engines of his comrades' planes roar to life, one after another. First one, then the second, the third. Their steady, powerful hum was music to him, a music that today had become a funeral march for his honor. He watched as their planes, light and graceful as dragonflies, taxied onto the runway. The sun reflected off their canopies, turning them into dazzling flashes of light. They were flying off to die. They were flying into eternity. And he was sitting here, in this motionless steel box, chained to the earth by a ridiculous, humiliating breakdown. Rage, hot and thick as tar, rose from the pit of his stomach, flooding his entire being. It wasn't rage at the mechanics or at the plane. It was rage at fate, at the gods who had laughed at him on the most important day of his life. Shame. The word pulsed in his temples, drowning out everything else. He, the top cadet of his class. He, who was entrusted with the honor of striking the first blow, had become a coward through no fault of his own. He had failed everyone, his commander, his comrades, his mother, his emperor. He pictured his comrades climbing now, their planes turning into tiny silver crosses against the vast blue sky. They were already there, on their way to glory, while he was here, on the ground, at the epicenter of his own personal hell. He slammed his fist on the instrument panel. The pain sobered him for a moment. He jumped out of the cockpit, his face a mask of fury. "Get me another plane," he yelled at the chief mechanic. The old man, his face like a baked apple, just shook his head. "No reserve aircraft, Lieutenant. They're all in the air or under repair. We need time." Time. He had no time. His time was running out with every second, with every meter that separated him from his squadron. At that moment, the sky to the west, where Hiroshima lay, suddenly lit up with a flash. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not a flash of lightning, not the burst of an anti-aircraft shell. It was as if someone had ignited a second sun, a magnesium, blindingly white, unbearably bright sun. It was so bright that for an instant all shadows vanished. The world lost its depth, becoming as flat as a drawing. Everyone at the airfield froze, instinctively shielding their eyes with their hands. Akira shielded his too. But even through his fingers, he could feel that unearthly, deathly light that seemed to penetrate to his very bones. And then, after a few moments that felt like an eternity, came the silence. Absolute. Unnatural. The birds stopped singing. The cicadas fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And in that dead silence, a sound began to grow from the west. At first, it was a low guttural rumble that traveled not through the air, but through the ground, making it vibrate. And then that rumble turned into a deafening, crushing roar, as if 1,000 demons had burst forth from hell all at once. The shockwave hit with the force of an invisible battering ram. It tore the cap from Akira's head, throwing him to the ground like a rag doll. He felt a searing, hurricane-force wind burn his face, filling his lungs with dust and ash. He saw hangars collapse like houses of cards, saw planes tossed into the air and twisted into heaps of mangled metal. People were screaming around him. The screams were short, cut off in mid-syllable. The world descended into a chaos of fire, dust, flying debris, and human terror. Akira lay on the ground, deafened, blinded, clutching his head, and a single thought hammered in his brain, more piercing than any fear, clearer than any realization. They never made it. His comrades. They never reached their targets. Their mission had failed. Their deaths were in vain. In that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to not just understand what happened, he had to see it with his own eyes. When the deafening roar subsided, replaced by the crackling of burning structures and the faint, barely audible moans of the wounded, Akira slowly raised his head. The world around him was unrecognizable. The air was heavy and hot, filled with the acrid smell of burning and something else, something unfamiliar, metallic and sweetish. The sky, which moments ago had been a piercing blue, was now being veiled by a gray-yellow haze, through which the sun appeared as a dim, sick-looking smudge. He looked around. Of the neat barracks and hangars of the airfield, only smoldering ruins remained. The twisted skeletons of aircraft were scattered across the field like a giant's discarded toys. People. Those who had survived were slowly getting up, their movements sluggish like people waking from a terrible nightmare. Their faces were covered in dust and blood, their clothes reduced to rags. Many were injured. Some sat on the ground, staring blankly into space. Others tried to help their comrades, but their actions were chaotic and senseless. The shock was so profound it paralyzed the will. Akira got to his feet. His body ached. A constant ringing filled his ears. But through the fog of shock, the soldier within him began to awaken. The discipline drilled into him through years of training took over from the panic. He was a soldier of the Imperial Army. He was an officer. He had to take control of the situation. But what control? What order? The entire structure, the entire familiar world had collapsed in an instant. He was an officer without an army, a pilot without a plane. He tried to brush the ash off himself, but it only ground deeper into the fabric of his scorched uniform. He looked to the west, toward Hiroshima. Over the place where a city of 350,000 people should have been, a gigantic, swirling column of smoke and dust was now rising into the stratosphere, taking the form of a monstrous mushroom. Its cap, colored in dirty orange and violet hues, continued to grow, to spread, obscuring the sun. It was a sight both horrifying and mesmerizing, like a volcanic eruption or the birth of a new, malevolent star. Mother. The thought pierced him like a red-hot needle. His mother was there. He had to get to the city. He had to find her. That desire, simple and primal, became his only purpose, his only order in this shattered world. He started to move. At first unsteadily, stumbling over debris, then faster and faster. He ran west, ignoring the screams and chaos behind him. The road to the city was clogged, not with cars, with people. They were walking from the city, or rather shuffling. They were not people in the usual sense of the word. They were shadows, phantoms, torn from the pages of the most terrifying legends of the underworld. Their clothes were burned away, hanging from them in black tatters, revealing horrific burns. On many, the skin was peeling off their bodies in whole sheets like wet paper. They walked in silence, with their arms outstretched to avoid their burned skin touching anything. Their faces were like masks, frozen in an expression of mute horror and suffering. Their eyes were vacant. They saw nothing around them. They just walked, away from the hell that had so recently been their home. Not a sound, not a moan escaped their throats. This silent shuffling river of mutilated bodies was more terrifying than any scream. Akira stopped, shaken to his core. He, a soldier who had seen death, was not prepared for this. This wasn't war. This was extermination. He tried to stop someone, to ask what had happened, but they didn't react. They flowed past him like water around a stone. Rain began to fall from the sky. But it was no ordinary rain. The drops were large, black and sticky, like oil. They left greasy, dirty stains on the skin. Black rain. It fell on these wretched souls, on the scorched earth, on the ruins. Akira knew he had to keep going, against this current, toward the place they were fleeing. He, dressed in the uniform of a soldier who was supposed to protect them, was now walking through the ranks of those he had failed to protect. A sharp, cold guilt clutched his heart. Guilt for not taking off. Guilt for surviving. He walked on, pushing through these silent, suffering bodies, and with every step, his military bearing, his officer's pride, his faith in a holy war, flaked away from him like ash, leaving only one thing behind: fear. Fear for his mother, and a terrible, unspoken premonition of what he was about to see. The closer Akira got to what used to be the outskirts of Hiroshima, the more the landscape changed. The familiar scenery of small wooden houses, rice paddies, and gardens had vanished, replaced by something unimaginable. Everything was covered in a thick layer of gray dust and ash. The trees stood naked, charred, their black skeletal branches reaching toward the gray sky like the hands of drowning men. The ground was littered with debris, roof tiles, pieces of wood, twisted metal. The air grew hotter, making it difficult to breathe. It smelled of death. As a soldier, Akira was trained to survive. He was taught navigation, first aid, how to organize a defense. In his mind was a clear set of instructions for any emergency situation covered by military regulations. But no military manual in the world could have prepared him for what he was seeing now. His skills were useless. How could you apply military tactics against an enemy who had already won by obliterating the battlefield itself? How could you provide first aid when there were thousands of dying people all around, their wounds not from bullets or shrapnel, but from something unknown, something that burned from the inside out? He still tried to act on instinct. He saw a woman lying on the side of the road. Her kimono was torn, her leg pinned by a heavy beam. She was moaning softly. Akira ran to her. Without thinking, he strained with all his might and managed to move the beam. The woman looked at him with clouded eyes, but there was no gratitude in them. There was nothing. A few minutes later, she stopped breathing. He walked on. He saw a small boy about 5 years old sitting on the ruins of his home, crying. He was completely alone. Akira approached him, wanting to say something to comfort him, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say to this child? He just sat down next to him on the hot stones and remained silent. After a while, the boy stopped crying and just stared at Akira with his huge, terrified eyes. Akira took the amulet his mother had given him from his pocket and offered it to the boy. The child took it mechanically, not understanding what it was. Akira stood up and walked on, leaving the boy alone amidst the desolation. He felt utterly helpless. His military training, his physical strength, his officer's rank, all of it was meaningless in the face of this catastrophe. He was not a savior, just another witness to the apocalypse. He was beginning to understand a terrible truth. His old world, a world of orders, discipline, and clear objectives, no longer existed. There were no enemies to attack, no positions to hold. There was only pain, death, and chaos. He tried to organize a group of survivors he met at a destroyed bridge. "We must stick together," he told them. "Find water. Help the wounded." But the people looked at him as if he were mad. They were broken. Their will had been incinerated along with their homes. They just sat on the ground, staring numbly at the river where bodies floated by. For the first time, he faced an enemy that could not be defeated by force of arms. This enemy was invisible. It was in the air, in the water, in the dust under his feet. Later, he would learn its name: radiation. He saw people with no visible injuries suddenly begin to vomit, their hair falling out in clumps, purple spots appearing on their skin. They faded before his eyes, and no one could help them. All his knowledge of wounds and bleeding was useless against this quiet, invisible death. It was his first defeat. Not a defeat as a soldier, but as a man who tried to bring order to absolute chaos. He realized that his old system, his military code, didn't work here. He was like a surgeon who'd come to operate with a hammer instead of a scalpel. His unexpected weapon was supposed to be discipline, but it proved powerless. He understood that to survive here, one needed something more than just following orders. One needed a different kind of strength, one he did not yet possess. Akira had been wandering through the ruins for hours, which had merged into one endless, nightmarish day. He had lost track of time. The sun, hidden behind a veil of smoke, could no longer serve as a guide. He walked on, driven by a single thought, a single image, the image of his home, a small wooden house with a garden where his mother should have been waiting for him. This thought was his compass in this hell. Gradually, he began to notice that amid the universal chaos and despair, the first shoots of order were appearing. It was not the kind of order that he, as a military man, had tried to impose. It was an order born from within, from the very depths of human nature. People who had survived the initial shock began to gather in small groups. They instinctively gravitated toward each other, seeking not so much protection as simple human warmth. These were families, neighbors, just random strangers bound together by tragedy. They cleared rubble, searched for water, and bandaged each other's wounds with whatever they could find. They created their own small, fragile empires from nothing, islands of sanity in an ocean of madness. Akira, for his part, tried to join several such groups. He would approach, introduce himself, offer his help. He was strong, young, an officer. He thought he would be welcomed, that his skills would be in demand, but he was met with distrust and even hostility. His uniform, once a source of pride, had now become a brand. To these people who had lost everything, he was a symbol of the very war machine that had led them to this catastrophe. "Where were you, soldiers, when it happened?" an elderly woman asked him, her eyes full of quiet hatred. "Why didn't you protect us?" What could he tell her? That at that very moment he was sitting on the ground cursing a faulty engine? That he was ready to die, but wasn't allowed to? The words would have sounded like a pathetic excuse. He was part of the system that had betrayed them. He tried to establish order as he had been taught, rigidly, authoritatively. He tried to command, to assign duties, to ration the food they found. But the civilians did not understand or accept his command tone. "You're not our commander," a man whose arm was hastily bandaged with a dirty rag told him. "Here, everyone is equal. Here, we survive together, not by following orders." This was a revelation for Akira. Accustomed to a clear hierarchy where an order from a superior was law, he had entered a world where his rank meant nothing. His attempts to create his own empire based on military discipline failed. He was cast out from these small communities, left alone again and again. He was a stranger among his own people, a soldier in a civil war against chaos where his methods didn't work. He was more alone than ever before in his life. His comrades had died in the sky, and those who survived on the ground would not accept him. He walked to the scorched earth, and his loneliness was as dense and heavy as the air he breathed. He was still a soldier, but his army consisted of one man, and his only mission remained the search for his mother. He didn't know what he would do if he found her. He didn't know what he would do if he didn't. He just kept walking, because movement was the only thing that saved him from complete despair. He walked past makeshift hospitals where the wounded lay directly on the ground, past people digging graves with their bare hands, past children who no longer cried. And in this hell, he searched for his home, or rather, the place where it once stood. On the second day of his journey through the dead city, when hunger and thirst had become almost unbearable and his strength was failing, Akira stumbled upon what, from a distance, seemed like a miracle. Amidst the endless ruins and ash stood the remains of an old Buddhist temple. The wooden structures had burned to the ground, but the massive stone walls of the inner courtyard and the foundation of the main building had survived, forming a kind of fortress, a protected space in the middle of the universal destruction. Voices came from behind the walls. They were not the groans of the dying, but calm, measured conversations. Intrigued, Akira found a breach in the wall and entered. What he saw astonished him. Inside the courtyard, sheltered in the shade of the surviving walls, was a group of survivors, 30 or 40 people. But this was not just a crowd of desperate individuals. It was an organized community. Some were clearing rubble, creating makeshift shelters. Women were tending to the wounded, using strips of cloth torn from temple banners as bandages. The children, surprisingly quiet, sat in a circle while a young woman told them an old fairy tale. At the center of it all was an elderly man in simple but clean robes, like those of a monk. He sat on a stone, sharpening a knife. His movements were slow, confident, and his face expressed absolute tranquility. This was teacher Ishihara, as Akira would later learn. Before the war, he taught history and calligraphy at a local school. When Akira, filthy and in his tattered military uniform, walked into the courtyard, all eyes immediately turned to him. They held the same distrust, the same wariness. He was already prepared to be driven away. But then a young man with a rough, weathered face approached him. His name was Ryuji. "Another hero protector shows up," he sneered. "Where were you when the sun fell from the sky, huh, officer?" Ryuji was what one might call the voice of despair. He too had survived, but the disaster had killed everything in him, except the animal instinct for self-preservation. He believed it was every man for himself, that any attempt to create order was a foolishness doomed to fail. He constantly argued with teacher Ishihara, considering his calm and faith in people to be a dangerous madness. "We should leave this place, look for food depots, take what we need by force," he would shout. "And you're here telling stories and moving rocks. We're all going to starve." Akira, hearing this, instinctively sided with order. He saw in teacher Ishihara the very structure he had futilely tried to create himself. But here it was different. It was held together not by orders and fear, but by something else, something he could not yet understand. He stepped forward. "I can help," he said, addressing not Ryuji but the old man. "I'm a soldier. I can organize a guard. I know how to handle." He faltered. What did he know how to handle? A weapon, which he didn't have. His words hung in the air. Ryuji laughed. "A god. From whom?" "From ghosts. Your war is over, little soldier. Now everyone has their own war. For a piece of bread and a sip of water, a conflict was brewing. Akira, raised to give and receive unquestioning obedience, was not used to being contradicted. His hand instinctively went to his belt, where his pistol holster used to be. But the pistol was gone. He was unarmed. At that moment, teacher Ishihara intervened. He stood up and walked toward them. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked first at Ryuji, and then at Akira. His gaze was remarkably clear and piercing. "Anger is a heavy burden," he said quietly, addressing both of them. "We don't have the strength to carry it right now. Ryuji-san, you fear hunger. That is natural. Lieutenant," he paused, "you fear dishonor. That is also natural for a warrior. But right now, we are all neither merchants nor warriors. We are just people who want to live to see tomorrow. And for that, we need hands, not swords or money. You, Lieutenant, have strong hands. Help us clear this rubble. There may be an entrance to the temple well beneath it." Those simple words disarmed Akira more effectively than any command or threat. The internal enemy, represented by Ryuji's cynicism, was temporarily subdued not by force, but by wisdom. But Akira realized that his true test was just beginning. Here, in these ruins, he would have to fight not enemy planes, but the ghosts of his past and the despair that lived in the hearts of the survivors. Akira stayed at the temple. He wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because it was the first place that hadn't thrown him out, or because there was some unknown power in old teacher Ishihara's tranquility that drew him in. He began to work, as the old man had asked. He cleared rubble, carried stones, reinforced the walls. The physical labor helped to distract him from the thoughts that swarmed in his head. He worked in silence, detached, still feeling like an outsider. He was a soldier, surrounded by civilians, a wolf in a flock of sheep. In the evenings, when the heat subsided, teacher Ishihara would come to him. He didn't ask questions about the war, about his service, about why he hadn't taken off. He spoke of simple and eternal things. He told him how the temple was built 300 years ago, about which wood was best for carving, about how to predict the weather by the color of the sunset. One day, he brought a go-board and 2 bags of stones, black and white. "Do you play?" he asked. Akira nodded. His father had taught him to play when he was just a boy. They sat on the ground and began a game. Other survivors gathered around, watching in silence. The teacher played slowly, considering each move. His strategy was not aggressive. He didn't try to capture Akira's territory, but instead built his own strong, solid shapes. Akira, on the other hand, played as if he were at war. He attacked, cut off his opponent's groups, tried to dominate the board. And he lost. Again and again. "You are in too much of a hurry," the teacher told him after another lost game. "You see only the battle, but you do not see the whole board. You try to destroy my stones, but you forget to build life for your own. Go is not just about war, Lieutenant. It's about creation. It's about the skill of finding life even in the tightest encirclement." These words struck Akira. He suddenly realized the teacher wasn't just talking about the game. He was talking about him, about his life, his faith. His entire Kamikaze philosophy was a philosophy of destruction. A beautiful, heroic destruction, but destruction nonetheless. He was meant to destroy himself and the enemy. He had never thought about creating anything. And now that his entire world was destroyed, he didn't know how to live. One day, disaster struck. A small fire, started by a careless accident, spread to the temporary shelters made of dry wood and cloth. Panic erupted. People ran around screaming, trying to save their meager belongings. Akira reacted instantly, as he had been trained. He started shouting orders. "Women and children! To the wall! Men! Put out the fire! Move!" But no one listened to him. The chaos grew, and then he saw a little girl, the same one who had been told fairy tales. Her name was Hana. She was huddled in the corner of one of the burning shelters, crying in fear, unable to move. The flames were getting closer. At that moment, something clicked in Akira's mind. All his thoughts of duty, of orders, of discipline, all of it vanished. He didn't see an object to be rescued, a civilian, but simply a frightened child. He rushed into the fire. The heat seared his eyebrows. His clothes began to smolder. He scooped the girl up into his arms and carried her out of the blaze. When he set her down, she clung to his leg and wouldn't let go. He dropped to his knees and hugged her. She was thin, trembling, and smelled of smoke. And in that moment, for the first time in many days, he felt something other than rage, shame, and despair. He felt a simple, overwhelming desire to protect this little life. When the fire was extinguished, Teacher Ishihara approached him. Akira was sitting on the ground, the girl asleep in his lap. "Today, you won your first game, Akira-san," the old man said softly. It was the first time he had called him by his name, without his rank. Akira looked up at him, and in that moment, he understood. He slowly, almost hesitantly, unbuttoned the collar of his burned officer's tunic. It was suffocating him. He took it off and folded it neatly. He was no longer Lieutenant Sato, the suicide pilot. He was just Akira, a man holding a sleeping child in his arms amidst the ruins of his world. For the first time in the entire war, he had taken off the uniform of a soldier and become just a man. A week passed. Life in the temple, if one could call it that, settled into its own harsh but steady rhythm. The people, united by a common tragedy and the quiet wisdom of Teacher Ishihara, learned to survive together. They cleared the well and got water. They learned to find edible roots that pushed through the ash. They treated wounds with herbal remedies that the elders remembered. Akira became an integral part of this small society. He no longer tried to command. He just worked, doing what was necessary, carrying water, strengthening walls, helping the weak. He spent a lot of time with Hana, the girl he had rescued from the fire. She had lost her entire family and now followed him like a shadow. He told her stories he had heard from his father as a child and made toys for her out of scraps of wood. Caring for this child became an anchor, keeping him from falling into the abyss of despair. He still thought about his mother, but now the thought was not sharp like a knife, but a dull, aching pain he was learning to live with. He looked at these people, teachers, merchants, fishermen, housewives, and saw an incredible strength in them. Not the strength he had once admired, the strength of weapons and fanatical faith. This was a different kind of strength. The quiet, stubborn strength of life itself which clings to any opportunity, like grass breaking through asphalt. He was learning from them. Learning to appreciate a sip of clean water, a piece of baked root, a quiet evening without screams and moans. He was learning to be silent and to listen. But one morning, their fragile world was shattered. Figures appeared on the horizon. They were not the phantoms shuffling out of the city. They were soldiers, but not in Japanese uniforms. Their uniforms were a different color, and they carried rifles of an unfamiliar design. Americans. The war was over. This news was brought by one of the soldiers who spoke Japanese. He said that the emperor had announced the surrender. Japan had lost the war. For most of the people in the temple, this was news of liberation, the end of the nightmare. They cried, they hugged each other, but for Akira, it was the final crushing blow. Surrender. The word was synonymous with the greatest shame. Everything he had lived for, everything he had been willing to die for, had been a lie. The great Japanese empire, which he had sworn to serve to his last breath, had ceased to exist. His sacrifice, like the sacrifices of millions of others, had been in vain. He stood apart, watching as American soldiers handed out water and canned food. He saw Hana accept a chocolate bar with delight from a tall, blonde soldier, and he felt an invisible wall rising between him and these people. They were saved. He was cursed. He was part of the defeated army, part of a shameful past. His survival, the fact that he hadn't taken off that morning, now seemed not a miracle, but a cruel joke of fate. If he had died then, he would have died a hero. Now, he was just a survivor, one of many. The Americans organized an evacuation. Trucks arrived to take people to refugee camps. Everyone gathered their things. Teacher Ishihara approached Akira. "Will you come with us, Akira-san?" he asked. Akira shook his head. "My place is here. I have to find my home." The old man gave him a long, understanding look. "Sometimes," he said, "to find your home, you must first lose it. Don't look for the stones. Look for what was built upon them. Farewell, Akira-san. Live." Hana ran up to him and hugged his leg tightly. "Are you coming too?" she asked. He stroked her hair. "No, Hana-chan. I still have things to do." He watched her drive away in the truck, clutching the bar of American chocolate. He watched as all those who had become almost a family to him in these terrible days departed, and once again, he was alone. But this was a different kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of a soldier who had lost his army, but the loneliness of a man who had lost his world. He set off through the empty streets of the ruined city. He was no longer in a hurry. He was simply walking to the place where his home once stood to fulfill his final duty. After the last trucks of refugees disappeared in a cloud of dust, a new, peculiar silence fell upon the ruins of Hiroshima. It was not the deafening silence after the blast, nor the tense silence of survival. It was the empty, indifferent silence of oblivion. Akira walked through streets that were already being cleared by the bulldozers of the occupation forces. He walked past American patrols who looked at him without interest. He was no longer an enemy. He was just part of the landscape, one of many Japanese in tattered clothes. He had become a hibakusha, a person exposed to the bomb. It was a new word, a new brand he would carry for the rest of his life. He found the place where his house had stood. Nothing remained but the foundation and a few charred planks. The garden his mother had loved so much had become a wasteland covered in gray ash. He stood there for a long time, feeling nothing. No grief, no pain, only emptiness. In the corner of what was once the garden, he saw something green. A small, stubborn sprout of some plant had pushed its way through the layer of ash and was reaching for the dim sun. This sprout was the only living thing for meters around. Akira knelt and carefully touched it with his finger. This tiny piece of life in the middle of a dead desert shook him more than anything he had seen before. He sat on the ground, and for the first time through all of this, he wept. He cried for a long time, soundlessly, tears carving clean paths down his dirty cheeks. He cried for his mother, for his comrades, for his lost faith, for his stolen death. He cried for the boy who had been ready to burn alive for the Emperor, a boy who no longer existed. When his tears dried, he felt a strange relief, as if something heavy he had been carrying inside him all these days was finally gone. He never found his mother's body. He found no trace of her fate, but looking at that green sprout, he understood what teacher Ishihara had tried to tell him. A home isn't the stones. It's the life that keeps growing, no matter what. He lived a long, quiet life. He never told anyone that he had been a kamikaze pilot. That past was both his shame and his salvation. Shame, because he had failed in his duty. Salvation, because that failure had allowed him to live. He carried this dual burden in silence, like a secret illness. He worked in construction, rebuilding Hiroshima from the ruins. With his own hands, he built new houses where the old ones had stood. He married and had children. They never knew who their father had been in a past life. To them, he was just a quiet, taciturn man with sad eyes who went to the Peace Memorial Park every week and stood for a long time before the cenotaph, a symbolic grave for all the victims of the bombing. He never spoke about the war, but sometimes, at night, he had dreams. He dreamed he was in the cockpit of his Zero, the engine running smoothly and powerfully, and he was flying toward a huge, shining sun. And in these dreams, he felt neither fear nor joy, only an infinite calm. He died at a ripe old age in his bed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, in a city that had risen from the ashes. His story never made it into the official chronicles. He did not become a hero. He did not become a traitor. He simply became a man to whom fate had given the most terrible and most precious thing, the life he had once so easily renounced. The official history of the Second World War is written in broad strokes. It contains the dates of great battles, the names of commanders, the casualty figures. But in this grand fresco, there's almost no room for the quiet, personal tragedies, for the stories that do not fit into the convenient frameworks of heroism or betrayal. The story of Akira Sato, the suicide pilot who survived a nuclear hell, is one such story. The newspapers didn't write about him. He wasn't awarded medals, nor was he tried by a military tribunal. His heroic act that never happened, and his survival which became his curse, were truths too inconvenient for a post-war Japan trying to both forget its militaristic past and mourn its victims. His story dissolved, became a whisper, one of many thousands of hibakusha stories. But among those who survived the hell of Hiroshima, a quiet legend circulated. It was said that for a long time, a young man in a tattered flight suit lived among the ruins, a man who spoke to no one but helped clear the rubble and search for survivors. They said he would sit for hours by the temporary graves, as if speaking with the dead. Some claim to have seen him rescue a little girl from a fire, and then simply vanish. No one knew his name. To everyone he was simply the ghost pilot, a symbol of unfulfilled duty and unimaginable survival. This story became an urban myth, a parable about how war mutilates the souls of even those it spares physically. Perhaps it wasn't Akira. Perhaps it was a composite character, born of collective trauma. But those who told the legend always added one detail. They said this pilot was not searching for glory or forgiveness. He was searching for a simple green sprout, pushing its way through the ash. This story is not just a chronicle of one man's survival. It is a reminder that in any war, even the most sacred, the most just, there comes a moment when ideology burns away, orders lose their meaning, and flags turn to ash. And then, only one thing remains. A simple human being, face to face with eternity and their choice, to die for dead ideas or to live for a fragile green sprout. Akira Sato, who flew to die for the emperor, but survived because his country died first, made his choice. He chose life. And in that quiet, unseen choice, there was more courage than in the most desperate kamikaze attack.